All right, everybody, welcome to the Ideas Lab, and I am going to first start with unsharing my screen so that you can see all of us. Okay, hello everybody. So we're getting going on our virtual panel on shifting fish stocks today. Thank you so much to everyone who joined. First of all, if you want to adjust your view of the panel, if you move your mouse around in the upper right, you can, use your own computer to set what view you want of the panel. If you want everybody next to each other or whatever it is. So for everyone who joined, know that you can do that in WebEx. My name is Emily Knight. I am the outreach manager for the Lenfest Ocean Program, and I'll be moderating the conversation today. First of all, want to start out with hoping everyone out there is safe and healthy. We know this is a difficult time for everybody, and we really appreciate you taking the time to join us today, even as the world continues to kind of shift under our feet here. So for those of you who don't know the Lenfest Ocean Program, we are a grant-making program. Our mission is to fund scientific research that addresses the needs of ocean and coastal managers and stakeholders. You can learn more at our website, which is lenfestocean.org. You can also follow us on Twitter at lenfestocean. We are actually live tweeting this panel. And you can also sign up for our newsletter. So why we're all here today. We wanted to hold this virtual panel on an ideas lab that Lenfest hosted back in October of 2019 on identifying research priorities for shifting marine species. And the Ideas Lab, which I will let Sarah Close walk you through in a few minutes, was a new process for Lenfest in terms of identifying new research projects to fund. It's not the usual process we go through to identify new projects, but we felt like the very complicated issue of shifting marine fish stocks and the challenges that it poses, not just to managers, but also to researchers, warranted a different way of doing things. And we wanted to have this event to actually reflect on the process of doing that. What worked, what didn't, and how it's informing our thinking of the challenge of shifting marine species, and to take your questions on that. So today's focus is not the projects themselves or necessarily management solutions to shifting marine species. It's about something that often gets lost, but we think is really critical to success, which is the notion of process. If you identify the right project, that's great, but if you don't do it in the right way, for complex and multidimensional issues like shifting fish stocks, you still might not get very far. It's about bringing people together. It's about having discussions among diverse participants to really figure out the science that can help open up solution options for managers to consider. And so today we're focusing a bit more on that process. And that's what we're looking forward to hearing your questions about. So we might not be able to answer all the questions you have. There's a lot of different elements of this issue, but please do submit them. In order to submit a question, use the Q&A panel and type it in. When we get to that point, I will read the questions to the panelists. If you want to specify a particular panelist that you're asking the question to, that is totally fine. They will all also have the opportunity to answer. And for our agenda today, like I said, we're going to start off with Sarah Close, who is a program officer with the Lenfest Ocean Program. She manages our climate and ocean portfolio and also was the key organizer on our end for the Ideas Lab. And then our other panelists are Susan Faraday, who is an assistant professor of marine affairs at the University of New England, Angee Doerr, who is an extension marine fisheries specialist with Oregon State University and Oregon Sea Grant. Meredith Moore, Director of the Fish Conservation Program at Ocean Conservancy, and George Maynard, the Policy and Research Coordinator for the Cape Cod Commercial Fishermen's Alliance. All of these folks participated in the Ideas Lab and are going to share with us some of their reflections. Once Sarah gives her introduction to the Ideas Lab, I will pose the first sort of general overarching question to the panel so that they can introduce themselves, where they're coming from, the role they played during the Ideas Lab. But then we really want to hear from you. I will only keep asking my questions if there aren't questions from you. So like I said, please do submit them in the Q&A panel at any point during this. You can submit them at any point, and I will just go in order. And if I miss your question, I apologize. We're all doing this remotely, so I have one computer screen in front of me, and we'll do my best to keep up. But know that we will be capturing all of the questions as well. So even if we either, accidentally miss it or, we run out of time, we will end at 4 o'clock. We will get all of the questions. So please do share with us what you're thinking and what you want to know. And I think that is everything on my end. I want to make sure we covered all of the bases. We did. All right, that's great. So I am going to start with turning it over to Sarah Close. So Sarah, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, great. Can you hear me?
I can.
Great. Nothing like speaking to a silent webinar. So thanks, Emily, for that intro and context, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. I just looked at the number of participants, and it's pretty impressive to see so much interest in this on a Monday afternoon. So what I thought I'd do today is just provide a little bit more context on the Ideas Lab goals and process to give a little background as the panelists sort of get into their comments. And I thought I'd start first with sort of why we decided to hold an Ideas Lab and why on this topic in the first place. So like Emily said, I manage Lenfest's portfolio of work that's focused on climate impacts on oceans. And the goal of that portfolio, like for all of the work that Lenfest supports, is really to inform decision-making on important marine issues, and in particular for my portfolio to think about that as it concerns climate impacts on oceans and where we can be providing information to help inform some of those decisions. And one thing we've noticed in this portfolio, which will come as no surprise, is that the issue of shifting fish stocks is really ever present in conversations about climate impacts on the oceans. As we have been working in this space and kind of building our portfolio here, it really comes up all the time, and it comes up in a lot of different ways from a lot of different perspectives and types of challenges. So we identified this as a major priority area for Lenfest, and we intended to support a number of research projects around that priority area, and sort of decided that we would really focus on this. So around the same time we were kind of making these decisions, we also learned about the Ideas Lab meeting format, which is designed to develop research ideas through a really collaborative, interactive, multiple-day meeting, where participants actually hear from each other about their experience with an issue, and you get people kind of thinking differently. So the goal is through these processes or these Ideas Labs, is really to develop projects or develop ideas that are innovative and creative, and that you might not get from a typical funding process or a typical sort of mode of developing new research ideas. So we decided to kind of combine the Ideas Lab format with the Lenfest Ocean Program model of working with and hearing from a lot of different perspectives on an issue to develop research projects, to have folks actually work together really intensively over a few days to develop project ideas collaboratively. So the ideas that emerged from this process were really then, because of this meeting format and in the facilitation that we used, which I should say we also worked with an organization called No Innovation to help facilitate this process. The ideas that came out of this were really informed by an understanding of sort of the pressure of the real world challenges that this issue presents, the capabilities of science and the new areas of research that could inform different aspects of this challenge, and the perspectives of people who are working on this from a lot of different research areas, a lot of different sort of professional experiences and perspectives, and regions around the continental US. And sort of put those things together to actually have people work together over the course of 3 days to come up with ideas. One thing I just want to be clear about, kind of straight off the bat, is that the Ideas Lab wasn't aimed at exhaustively cataloging research priorities or all of the research questions surrounding the issue of shifting fish stocks. While uncovering research questions and kind of getting them out there was a really important part of the process, the end goal was to move from that towards developing these new innovative research project ideas that people felt could really advance not just our understanding of the issue, but also the solutions that could be possible, or where information could fit into management decisions or other types of deliberations. Like Emily said, we're not going to talk about the project ideas that came out of that today, but we want to have more of a conversation about the process and share those perspectives. And so as those projects do become funded, we will be sharing them. And I think by virtue of being on this webinar, you will probably get emails about that, I'm sure. So what we did do at the Ideas Lab was really try to understand what are the research questions out there. From there, what are the types of research project ideas that could really tackle some of those questions in a way that would be useful and usable for managers and decision makers. So really what would actually move the ball forward on the issue. And the process was all really designed to get us there, from participants who are coming from a lot of different regions and areas of expertise, to a small team of mentors who represented different types of perspectives, but could also play a role of kind of moving between groups and asking questions, providing their perspective and guidance from their experience, and helping push people to think differently or more deeply about kind of how their ideas were shaping up. And to the process from the beginning, where the groups and the participants really tried to lay out a whole bunch of different questions and use different methods to really dig pretty deep and come up with questions that are not just the sort of obvious ones or low-hanging fruit that we all think of when we think of this issue, to people kind of selecting the types of questions they were interested in and thought would actually help advance the issue. And there's another element of this, which was also that people could move around a lot. So we had a lot of fluidity of these groups as they were all forming. As people were working on ideas, they would often move between groups. Groups would kind of come together around a central theme and then realize that it was actually two project ideas and kind of split up again. But there was a lot of cross-fertilization and conversations happening across the entire group of participants over the course of 3 days. So the ideas that came up in the Ideas Lab really reflect a lot of sharing and perspectives from across the whole group of participants in the process. And it was really a community effort and took a lot of work of all of the highly engaged and very willing participants to show up and do that work and really contribute in a very meaningful way. And so I just want to recognize that as well as being really critical to this process. And I'm really excited to hear what the rest of the panel has to say about this. So I think maybe I'll stop there. Hopefully that's sort of helpful context as we move into hearing from the panelists.
Great, thank you, Sarah. That was great. And just a reminder, folks, to ask a question, type it into the Q&A. But I will start with a first question to all the panelists, which is, can you speak to the Ideas Lab process? The provocateur talks, the mentors, no innovations, facilitation, whatever aspect you want. And then describe what aspects of the approach you thought were especially helpful. So I guess I will pick Susan. Would you like to go first?
Sure. Audio okay? Great.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Terrific. Well, so let me talk a little bit about my perspective. So I had the privilege of being one of the mentors, which was a fascinating role. And I don't know about everybody on this webinar, but I've been a part of many facilitated things and strategic planning process things, either as a participant or in the facilitator or voting with dots or the flip chart, all that stuff that we all have used before. And this process was described to me as something totally different, which was intriguing, but I was also honestly a little skeptical because it sounded super intense, super ambitious. And this, so if the facilitator is supposed to be at the 10,000 foot level, the mentors were supposed to be at the 5,000 foot level. So not really worrying about the schedule and some of the facilitative-y stuff, but really able, as was described, to kind of float in and out of the different groups and offer some perspective, ask some questions. It was a fascinating process, and I come at this as a lawyer and a law and policy geek who's thought about this a lot, and it was fascinating to hear the breadth of ideas and expertise and all the different options for bringing them together. There's a number of things that would stand out, but I got to say the one that I consistently return to in my head when I think about this experience was the facilitation. It was masterful. They kept us all busy and working hard, but engaged and having fun. And they used all kinds of different techniques. It was a process that I was like, this could work for a lot of difficult, thorny problems. But particularly for this one, which, as Emily said, this is a problem that crops up over and over and over and over again. I assume you're all on this webinar because you have some contact with this issue, and how do we get our hands around it, and what do we think about addressing it going forward? So this process really worked very well with that kind of a thorny problem, and I can't say enough about the facilitation. So I'll stop with that. Is that what you wanted? Sorry, I went on.
No worries. That was great. And next, how about Angie?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Susan. I will say, as a participant at the Ideas Lab, I was a little bit jealous of you and the other mentors because of that different groups. As mentioned, the facilitation was really fantastic. The Ideas Lab started off really kind of putting everyone on a nice level footing by having some high-level overviews, information put out by the provocateurs, and then really the facilitators took over and put us through some just general exercises, some silly stuff to get us all kind of relaxed and in the moment, and really gave us get to know each other. And for me, that was fantastic because it made me realize all the different voices and perspectives that were in the room. I think Lenfest did a really good job of trying to bring together people from different geographic regions, different backgrounds. You had, of course, academics and researchers, but you had managers, you had people from NGOs, you had people from Sea Grant, and you had people that actually are active fishermen or part of the fishing community. And I'll let George and Meredith talk about some of the roles that they played there with those things, but it was really neat because you got to have engaged conversations with people that had a variety of different perspective and hands-on experience. And I would say one of the biggest takeaways would be the fact that when they first told us to start kind of just coming up with ideas of things, issues around climate change and shifting marine species, we had, I think, I don't even know how many, lots and lots and lots of ideas and issues. And I think the hardest part for the participants and probably for the facilitators as well was really getting us to kind of narrow down and focus in on some of these. And so there were a lot of things that I think people would have liked to pursue, but the point of the Ideas Lab wasn't necessarily to pursue every topic or every area of interest. It was really to kind of figure out what we as a group, as the participants, could get more engaged in it and carry further. And so that was a really, really interesting exercise in looking at what sort of issues were common across all of these different groups, all these different geographies, and things that really were, amongst all the variety of different directions we could go, things that were really identified as really important, really pressing, really immediate issues. And I thought that was really interesting and rewarding.
Very cool. Great. Thank you. Meredith, let's hear from you.
Hi, are you okay? We're good. Awesome. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so this Ideas Lab was, I'm so pleased to have been invited because I feel like there's never a time in my life where I get to spend 3 days doing one thing. And so if nothing else, like specifically carving out the time to focus on one thing and really tease it out in a lot of different directions was such a, like, I want to say luxury, but it was also just like such a treat. Like, it was so enjoyable to do that and to do it with such an engaged, smart group of people, to get to come in with kind of a no bad ideas. Everyone is here to achieve the same sort of goal, like speak your darkest secret thoughts you've had about shifting stocks right now in a big space with lots of people. And it was incredible to get to spend that time together and think through all of those ideas and to engage so collaboratively with everyone. We were also just like exhausted, I will say, every day. I mean, everyone came in and put their entire heart and soul into coming up with those ideas and working, like the work that people brought to it. And I think that goes a long way to the facilitation as well, because it's so, you put that many people in a room and you say, okay, what I want you to do is think creatively, to get actually anything out of that by the end of 3 days and to have it constantly progressing and making progress and refining ideas, I think was a real art form. I was really impressed with the way that they kept us moving and progressing through things. I also really appreciated the opportunity to, I've joked about this with the folks on this call, to actually have a seat literally at the same table as a lot of these other people. The role of ENGOs often in the fishery management process is rarely to be sitting right next to the same people and having the same conversations. It was really nice to have this more egalitarian, like everyone is there together and we're all working in the same direction. Ocean Conservancy works with managers and fishing partners and all sorts of people, but it really felt like a community effort to come together with these ideas where everyone was a key part of that, in my opinion, and I thought that was really useful. And I'll emphasize what Angie said, the number of ideas we generated in that first day was substantial. And then we did a process of like sorting them into key topics, which even that was substantial. I forget the number we ended up with of like, okay, we've piled them into piles, but I think it was well over 12 to 20 different piles, somewhere in that range. And so I thought that was really fascinating, but I did, one key thing I noticed out of that is that even during that process, we still struggled to create piles that connected science and management. We ended up with science piles and management piles, and I think that continued to be a thing we tried to tease out and work through as the Ideas Lab went through. So while that was, I think, a challenge, having it so visually obvious to us that even we, the people who are coming in to think about these issues and try to solve them, are still creating those buckets where they're separate, I think was a really interesting thing that came out of that original process.
Great. All right, George.
All right, so yeah, I guess I would just echo what other folks have been saying about the facilitation being really pretty incredible. I'm not a terribly extroverted person, so it sometimes takes a lot to pull me out of my shell, and they did a great job of that. I mean, just some of the silly activities from the get-go to put you at ease with other people, and then forcing us to constantly change tables so that you interacted with people from a bunch of different regions, a bunch of different backgrounds. It was really pretty eye-opening and an interesting experience in that regard. One thing that I thought was incredibly valuable about the whole experience was being able to sit down with groups that the organization, so in the fishing industry, obviously there's politics. Not every fishing community sees eye to eye. Fishing communities don't necessarily see eye to eye with managers, but being able to sit down with groups that we've struggled with in the past or had not great relationships with in the past, actually have productive conversations, honest conversations, and come up with ways to work together moving forward that we've carried on since October. That was really really helpful. And I think sort of in the vein of thinking about how things were sorted, I was it was interesting to me to see things get sorted or sort of see projects fall into one of two buckets. There were some projects designed to meet immediate data needs, and some projects that are sort of designed to produce simulations and forecasting. And both of those are really important steps moving forward. And I thought it was good to see both of those approaches represented.
Great, thank you. And Sarah, I should ask, do you have anything you want to kind of add as you went into the Ideas Lab, not as a direct participant, but one who played a really big role in getting everybody there and setting the agenda?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think I reflected on some of this in the beginning, but, to me, one of the most kind of gratifying things to see as this process unfolded after we had spent, almost the better part of the year kind of thinking about it and scoping it and trying to figure out, is this something we should do and would it actually work? One of the amazing things to see was actually how quickly everyone kind of jumped in and was like very, very willing to go along with the plan, even though they didn't actually totally know what the plan was until like it was unfolded in front of them as they were going. And so, I think we were really appreciative of the willingness of all the mentors and participants to kind of come to this effort and come to the room with a really open mind and kind of generosity of, sharing their perspectives and listening to others and trying to, think about it as, as one of you said, like a community effort and like, what do we need to be thinking about to actually move the ball forward on this? So we had thought that, in our wildest dreams, like that was kind of what we thought might happen, but it was very cool to actually see it happen and to watch it unfold over the course of 3 days and watch everything kind of congeal into different priorities and different groups.
Great. Oops, I think Meredith is waving. You are on mute.
Hi, hello, sorry. Yes, there's like 17 mutes. This is what all of life is going to be like for a while. How many different ways have you put yourself on mute? And I'm not just saying this because I'm looking at Susan, but I feel like I neglected to note how useful I found the mentors to be in the process. And so I just wanted to go in and put a plug for that piece of how the process was designed and also the folks that you selected to be those mentors. I thought that was really exceptional. It was really, again, I'm still surprised that we managed to come out of 3 days of think creatively with anything tangible, because that is just, with that many people, is an amazing feat. And so to me, having that like constant check-in with like an additional brain to come in and be like, oh, honey, you're way down a rabbit hole. Like, come back to, like, come on back up. Like, there's something down there. I can see what you're seeing, but like, come on back and think about how this can connect to whatever and start bringing those things back together. I thought that was a really phenomenal piece of the process, getting to have access to those additional minds to give their perspective and help guide you as you move through. So I just wanted to give an extra plug to that part of the process.
Yeah, if I could just echo that, I think, it was sort of like an expedited peer review, which was awesome. I mean, having your ideas examined critically by someone else who's got a completely different perspective is really helpful. So the mentors were great.
Great, thank you for that. And I think I'll hold this until the end, but I'll plant it for you guys to think about, which is maybe we'll end this with saying any ways you actually think it could have gone better or things we could have done a little better. But I want to jump into the Q&A. So our first question was, is this going to be recorded? And yes, it is being recorded, everybody. That was the one thing I forgot to mention in my intro. And then secondly, we have a question here. As usual, The problem here will be less fish than the human dimension. How much of your work is on the human dimension? And by human dimension, he's saying human and governance response to stock shift. So anybody, that's to everybody. So Angee, go ahead.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I will say, it looks like that's Mike Orbach, so hi, Mike. But there was a nice mix in the room of people that are actual, practitioners or people that do social science, as well as people that were more on the natural science and modeling side. And I will say, I've mentioned this before, so this shouldn't come as a surprise when I say this to this panel. At the end of the Ideas Lab, most of the topics that people started working around were more on the fish side. How are fish responding? What are fish going to do? How can we model fish? Because it's easier. It's easier to ask those questions and figure out where you're going to get the data from and figure out what the, science is. But there were a handful of us, a couple of teams that really did focus in on the social dimensions. What do we need to be doing at the management level to make management more flexible, more resilient to change? And what do we need to be doing in fishing communities, both with the fishing folk themselves, as well as with the communities that support them, in order to make them more resilient to these changes that are going to come, that are going to impact people's livelihoods? And so I wouldn't say there was an even split between those kind of topics. But there was definitely a lot of interest in both. And there was a very wide recognition that understanding what's going on under the water only would get us so far. Respond. Shifting gear, shifting, what we could do in terms of markets, creating community level support for our fishermen, things like that. So there was a lot of recognition that needed to be done.
Great. Does anybody else want to jump in? Go ahead, Meredith.
Yeah, basically what Angee said, but I'll add more words around it. So I think she's absolutely right that management was the trickier part, and how I think we didn't get into as many parts of the people will be affected by this. Do we approach it from a people's perspective, or do we approach it from a fish perspective? It was much more the wet side rather than the human side that we kind of engaged with. That being said, I think every group and every project recognized it as a big part of the problem, that management, everything that they wanted to work on needed to have some connection to management. I think in the process of the 3 days, not all of the projects figured out that piece as far as maybe they have since or have thought about it more. But I think I was at least really encouraged to see not one group didn't think that the management piece was important. Like, everyone agreed, yes, I'm creating some science or thinking about this from a science side, but I want to benefit from the managers in the room. I want to benefit from the perspective of the fishers. I want to talk to the people who write really long comment letters all the time, that's me, to try to figure out like how to bring this relevantly to the work that was going on. I'm not sure that the 3 days Idea Lab solved all of our problems there, but I do think I was really hopeful to see an intent to create science that could go into science-based management, which I think is always such a tricky bridge to cross.
Great. Yeah, go ahead, Susan. Oh, you're muted.
Yep.
Oh, now you're not. There you go.
Now I'm back. Okay. So I was particularly interested in this, and I will absolutely back up what Angee and Meredith said in terms of, the whole interdisciplinary approach was kind of a theme of the whole thing. But what was interesting but not surprising to me was, as we were narrowing down buckets and specific projects that could be researched, there was some fairly predictable breakdown, that there was way more on more traditional science, biological, ecological science piece. And then we really had this one group. Do you guys mind if I share the name? We called it the Burn It All Down group, because we kept coming into the, well, how do we even use this cumbersome management system that was never ever designed to take in the kinds of science that we're talking about, much less respond to what's going on in the ecosystem? So we had this sort of provocative title, let's just scrap the whole thing. But it was, again, from the mentor point of view, it was really interesting because this had the most sort of diverse set of stakeholders during that last day and a half. We were really trying to gel projects together. We had the NGO side and the Sea Grant side, and just some other industry representation, just some other voices, whereas some of the other groups more traditionally were academics that are used to cranking out proposals and funding stuff. So I wasn't surprised that we didn't generate as many specific concrete projects. And I think we identified that was definitely sort of I'm probably jumping to your last question, Emily, but that management human community, how does this work? How does it actually work in the decision-making world? There's a lot of work left to do on that, but this process at least helped us tee that up. And the management piece was definitely part of all of those other scientific groups thinking.
Great, thank you. Go ahead, George.
Yeah, so I think the group that I ended up sitting with for a lot of a couple of days was really involved in our idea was looking at giving fishing communities agency in the data collection and science piece, because the recognition is that those relationships between managers, scientists, and the communities that are affected by those decisions are really important. So even if the data contributions aren't overwhelming or don't make a huge difference compared to some of the more standardized sampling methods, just including them and giving the fishing communities a voice at the table can go a long way in building relationships and creating buy-in from the stakeholders.
That's a great point. That's a good point. And, we have another question here. Any qualitative focus on how to stimulate the base to advocate for climate research used in fisheries management when it may not be top of mind? And, and I can jump in and say, the goal of the Ideas Lab was to generate research priorities. So there wasn't discussion on, how advocating for climate research. But, one piece of this question that I think is really interesting is especially how things have changed. So the question has, when things may not be a priority, like such as their fishery is not impacted as greatly, or now COVID-19 and now the world is changing. And so I would love to hear from the panelists their thoughts on how priorities are shifting in a time where we're in a bit of survival mode, and what this issue means to you now, even if we're not talking about the advocacy per se. All right, George, go ahead.
I think you'd be hard pressed to find a fishing community is not engaged in actively trying to better understand the world around them, and not only better understand the world that they rely on for their livelihoods, but also get help spread that perspective and spread that knowledge to other folks who have the power to make decisions. Throughout, at least in the Northeast, the fishing industry is facing a lot of challenges, everything from overfishing and bad data to the development of large offshore wind farms, and how that will affect not just fishing itself, but also the science that goes into fishing and management. And I think it's really people are engaged in that idea now that they need to understand the world around them, and they need to help other folks to do the same.
So I can echo some of that and say from the Pacific Northwest, the fisheries I work with here, we're not seeing change in fish stocks quite as rapidly as they are on the East Coast, but we are seeing it. And so the fishermen and the fishing communities actively recognize that change is coming and that they need to be on top of it. I'm not going to say every fisherman out there believes or will acknowledge that climate change is the issue. A lot of them do, though, and a lot of them are acknowledging that the changes they're seeing now are not just normal cyclical changes or the same thing they've been seeing for the last 50 years they've been on the water. The things are bigger changes are happening, and they're happening faster. And this is the livelihood for a lot of these communities and the culture. And so they want to respond. They want to be proactive. They want to figure out what they can do to address the change. And some of that's because, if a new species is moving in, you want to be able to take advantage of it. You want to be able to fish it. You want to develop a market for it. And also, if a key species is moving out, you figure out what to do about that before it puts everyone out of business. So regardless of the terminology different communities are going to use around this, the recognition that things are changing is definitely there. And so I think it's not a battle we've had to fight. And as far as most community members I've talked to with other fishing communities, that's not really a battle they've had to fight. At the national level, perhaps, but within the actual fishing communities, not so much.
Go ahead, Meredith.
Hey, it's Meredith. Yeah, so I would say I think one of the interesting things about trying to get, and I'm going to do this from the nationwide perspective, because I agree that from a regional perspective, I think you can usually find fishermen who are experiencing similar things and they see it and it matters to them and they want to do something about it. I will say it has been, I think, more challenging to build what a national response to that would be, or a national voice around it, because it does look different in different regions. And so while it is kind of the same core fundamental mechanics behind it, the actual application of it to different regions is very different. And so I think one of the challenges will be, if we want to see more nationwide attention to this issue, is figuring out how to get the voices connected from the different regions and different stakeholders who are seeing it and seeing different things, and getting them to agree that they're seeing the same manifestation of the same thing and work together. Like, I think that is going to be one of the challenges. When fishermen advocate for themselves, there is no better way to get something done in fisheries management than when the fishermen are working on it, and those organizations, those regional groups, when they are focused on it and they are the voice for the things that they want. There's no better way to change management than that. If shifting stocks and climate change generally are going to cause nationwide issues, figuring out how to bring those to a nationwide discussion, I think, is a challenge. Sorry, I put advocacy Meredith hat on real quick. But I do want to super acknowledge that right now is an incredibly weird time to talk to people about shifting stocks, because most of the fishermen that I know and talk to are currently trying to figure out if they should even go out fishing. And the answer for most of them is no in a lot of cases. Like, there's real disruptions occurring right now. And I just want to be really, conscious of the fact that they are dealing with a lot of incredibly serious bottom line issues right now. And that will and should take priority for them for a period of time. I think there's just no getting around that. Unfortunately, shifting stocks aren't going away, so we'll get to come back to it later. But right now, I think it's the focus for those fishing communities is rightly on how they're going to get through the next couple of months to a year. What does fishing look like going forward?
Great. I will jump. We have a great question here. I am wondering if you think the model of this Ideas Lab could extend beyond the U.S. to involve local people and traditional ecological knowledge in other countries struggling with management. What would you change?
Susan can go first. Good. Susan.
I definitely think this model could apply both beyond the U.S. To engage local communities in traditional ecological knowledge. And I think any of us who've thought about this issue know that it's not limited the US. It's not limited to the Northeast. But I think Meredith makes a really good point. We're seeing, and Angee as well in her work with the West Coast, we're seeing different rates of change affecting different ecological and human communities very differently. I think the key around, at least my experience of this particular ideas lab, was the way that the topic was framed and the way that the participants were selected to reflect a range of geography, expertise, perspective. So that's going to look really different from an ideas lab focused on shifting stocks in the US than an ideas lab model in pretty much any place else. But I think it's really the way the topic is sort of framed up and the participants, because that was key as far as my perspective from the mentor piece, was just seeing having the right ingredients there.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I am in like so many disclaimers because I am in no way an expert on this, and so I just wanted to put that out there. I think the model could apply, but I want to put like I know I'm supposed to say like yes and, but this one feels like a yes but to some degree, which is that like I think the way that this one was set up was to really kind of produce science projects, right? And in order to, or science and management projects to address this issue. And I think that one of the real challenges with incorporating traditional ecological knowledge and inviting local peoples into the process, et cetera, is that they don't always enter on a level playing field and people don't already understand or value the information that they're bringing. The Ideas Lab kind of assumed a baseline at the beginning that we all understood what the other people were bringing to the table and how that could be incorporated, because we were all used to that part of the fisheries management process, from the science to the management to the stakeholders. And I think you would have to do, if you wanted to bring those other issues and people into the conversation, I think you would have to do more work up front to better educate the other participants in what that value was, because I think that has been a thing that's been missing from US management for the most part. And so I think you'd have to really add a big piece at the beginning that was more educational, and maybe break it into two pieces where you had a more educational piece first, where you taught and demonstrated the value of this knowledge, and then engaged in an ideas lab, because you don't want the traditional knowledge practitioners to have to be explaining and defending their valued work at the same time as trying to get everyone together to figure out how to use it. So that would be my amendment to the process.
Yes, that's a great point. And we actually got a question in the chat that might be a good one for you, Sarah, which is, asking about the facilitator, which was a group called No Innovation, and KNOW Innovation, and what kinds of activities and what kinds of approaches they brought to this. And I direct this at you, Sarah, because you work so closely with them, and Ideas Labs are what they do.
Yeah, so and this connects, in some ways to the previous question about sort of what other context could you do an Ideas Lab in. And in No Innovation, the group we worked with, they started the sort of concept of doing an Ideas Lab about 15 years ago. So they've been doing this for a very long time, and they've held Ideas Labs on all sorts of different subjects. And so it's a tool that, to the previous question, I think works for, a number of different topics. I mean, they would bring up examples of like Ideas Labs on seismology or the opioid crisis in ways that our Ideas Lab kind of reminded them of those. And so the concepts are very different, but the tools and the way they go about the meeting were kind of consistent. And I say that in part because, some of that is because of the goals of an Ideas Lab. So, one of the ways that I think of it really differing from like a typical facilitated workshop or stakeholder meeting is that with an Ideas Lab, the goal is really to get at ideas and to, have people share their perspectives and share where they're coming from, but really to think about like, okay, what are the research questions out there? What do we think would actually move the ball forward on whatever issue you're trying to tackle? And what are some of the priorities? And so really having a clear charge and a clear question and topic kind of related to that was really critical in the Ideas Lab. So you weren't so much moving through an agenda that changed topics like you might in a traditional kind of workshop where you might talk about, one thing in the morning and something totally different in the afternoon with different goals. The whole thing was designed around this goal of getting at, new different ideas for research questions. So that's kind of the key difference. I would say, as we were designing this with No Innovation, one of the things that I thought worked really well was that they, once they understood what for Lenfest our like normal process and way of doing things was, which included a lot of kind of talking to stakeholders and talking to managers as well as talking to researchers. But once they understood kind of that as well as our goals, they really thought about the process of the Ideas Lab in terms of designing it to get to those goals. And so, we did a few kind of virtual activities like webinars ahead of the Ideas Lab itself as well. We did an open call for participation. We did, we had mentors, we had provocateurs giving short kind of video talks. All of that was designed to get at our goals. An Ideas Lab for a different type of topic might be designed a little bit differently. But I think that kind of broad overarching focus on ideas and coming up with kind of new ways of thinking about a problem, that to me is like sort of the key difference between this and a kind of typical meeting or workshop.
Great, thank you. And we actually have a couple of questions here that dig a little bit more into the process that I want to acknowledge. How did we decide on the number and range of invited participants to ensure, we were getting the diversity of input desired? And just to give a little context with this question, because Brandon, thank you, Brandon, also as a follow-up question of just trying to understand the process and approach and how it's different than a typical sort of facilitated stakeholder meeting. Perhaps, Susan, you can also provide some thoughts on the mentor role there. So, Sarah, you already started talking about some of this, but do you want to say a little bit more about how we got the participants and ensured that diversity and how it was different than other meetings?
Yeah, sure. So we held, the main way we found participants is actually by holding an open call for them. And so we explicitly didn't want to just kind of hand select people to come to this meeting. We thought there would be a lot of interest, and we also wanted to, find out who was interested and who we might not know out there who works on this issue from a variety of perspectives. And so we had an open call over the course of last summer and got a pretty great response to that. A lot of applications, more than we expected, which is really, really great. And so we were able to select from those applicants to make sure that we had people from multiple regions, that we balanced different types of sort of academic or kind of research expertise, that we had people from different types of NGOs and different ways of participating in fisheries, different aspects of the industry, and balancing all of those with kind of regions and institutions and a number of other constraints was an interesting challenge. But because we had so many applicants, we were able to fill the room just with people who had applied kind of through that call. And I think, in some ways, in a lot of ways that really helped. I mean, it helped us introduce us to people who we didn't know before, and it helped us find out kind of who else is interested in this and what other types of research perspectives like we might not have considered had we not done it that way. So I think that was like actually a really good lesson for us at Lenfest. This is the first time we've done a call for participation like this, and I think we definitely saw some really clear benefits to it.
great. And, does anybody have anything else to add to that too, from your perspective, but would also like to hear a little bit from Susan about the mentors?
Sure, because it was a really unusual, unlike any meeting that I've been to, and I've been to a lot of meetings, both as a participant and as a facilitator, chair of the group or whatever. And what was different about the mentor role, at least from my perspective of being one of the mentors, is that it was this in between. So I got to still think about the topics without paying attention to the agenda, without keeping an eye on the different groups and seeing who was doing what. So that was really liberating, but I like Meredith's example, and I don't know if I was the one that told her to get out of the rabbit hole, but it was really, it was just a unique role because you could still have your expertise from the mentor perspective and not be worried about the details and some of the facilitation, picky but really important stuff, but picky stuff and diverting. But go into among these different groups and literally kind of float, observe, listen to what's going on, ask some questions, maybe make some suggestions. So it was a really interesting intermediary sort of step. And again, I was really not sure how it was going to work. And it was really, I learned a lot. I wasn't just in, kind of hovering mentor mode. I got a tremendous amount by getting to hear the rich cross-pollination that was going on in each of those groups. So.
That's great, thank you. And we got a couple of comments in here from Patricia. Patricia, thank you for those about, the idea of giving fishermen agency fits in very well with the social science practice of participatory research, which is something we are trying to increase use of. One issue is how to figure out doing this in a cost-restricted environment. And also, she mentioned that the issues related to like traditional ecological knowledge are obviously not issues just outside the US. So that's really helpful. Thank you, Patricia. I'm going to ask one more question that we have here and also end with my final question of what you think could have been better. But I think this question leads into it, which is, a question that given stock shifts will actually be relatively obvious and uncontrollable, should we not be paying the most of our attention to researching human and policy response? So welcome that. And, as a final thing, anything that, your thoughts on how the Ideas Lab could have worked better, especially addressing thorny issues like that.
So I'll go real quick. I know we only have a few minutes left. I'll say first off that trying to solve a lot of these really thorny issues in 3 days is maybe asking a lot. And so if anything with the Ideas Lab, I think we were asked to do a lot in a very short period of time, which is understandable, also mildly frustrating because I feel like all of us felt like if we'd had like one more day, we've gotten so much further. And a lot of it was the fact that we found out, we were trying to generate ideas that we could actually develop research proposals around. And some of the social science ones, the management ones, that's just a more mentioned, as Mike's mentioned, it can be quite a bit more challenging to get the human participants and the funding and engage with all these diverse communities and really try to figure out what all these independent individual communities need. And so it would have been nice to have more time to work on that. But I will say there are several of us that are still working on that and still working on a proposal that's going to be looking at that exact issue. But to answer kind of that issue from Mike, in order to develop management plans that can be effective and proactive, it helps to know what we're expecting to see rather than just being like, whatever comes along, we'll fish it. It's nice to have an idea of what's coming, what changes we're expecting to see so that we can start being proactive in developing management plans, adapting gear, figuring out how you're going to allocate quota, things like that.
Cool. Does anybody else want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I'll take the Dr. Orbach's question first, which is, shouldn't we be spending most of our time researching human and policy response? I think it has to be both. I think there are really, I'm management side almost all the time. And so, I'd love to say, yeah, no more science, but no, we've got to have both, because we have to have a science-based management system in some way, because we have to have some sense of what is still sustainable. Because we're not going to know as things shift what sustainable is and what it isn't unless we still do that science side. I am firmly a believer that we've got to make our science more relevant to management, not just like we did out of this ideas lab, but all over the place. We've got to strengthen those connections. I will say there's a lot of really innovative techniques, I think, being used to try to bring those things together and bring the stakeholders more involved, like scenario planning and other things like that, where they're, thinking of how various scenarios are going to impact fisheries, and then start planning for how management will address those so fishermen know what's coming. So I think there's definitely tools like that that need to be used a lot more in a lot more areas. To the point of how would I improve the process for the ideas lab, two things jumped at me, and I think Angie mentioned one of these. It did really feel like towards the end it was easier to make a science research project than it was to make a different research project. And maybe that's just because that's the muscle that we're all more used to using, but it was more challenging to figure that out. And I also struggled with the idea of coming in, we were prompted to think really big about stuff. And then as the time went on, I was like, okay, but now I have to create a practical research problem out of this. And so reining myself back from huge, big to actually doable, and where that line was, I think was a challenge over the time for me. So just flagging that.
Cool. Does anybody else have anything to add?
Sure. I think that. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think that also looking at some of the process by which science happens is important. And I don't know if that fits into social science or not, but just looking at ways that we can streamline the sources of information that we are already collecting, and getting those into the hands of managers and decision makers. So that sort of process research is I think important as well.
So just 30 seconds, I totally concur with Angee and Meredith. That it definitely became clear to me in that last day that we needed more time on the burn it all down social policy management piece. And I'm really torn whether to say that we should have started with if we wanted to get to that end point of some clear articulate projects with the right folks to talk about how to set that up as a research project. I don't know if we needed more time in the whole ideas lab, or if there needed to be a differently designed sort of ideas lab to get in that, but that definitely felt like that's where we needed more time. We maybe needed some different representation in that group as well.
Great. Well, I want to thank our panelists for taking the time to do this, to share your expertise, share your thoughts. We really appreciate it. Like I said, this has been recorded, so we will be sharing the recording. And do feel free to follow up if you want to talk more with us at Lenfest. My email is eknight@pewtrust.org. We're always happy to chat more about the Ideas Lab and what's coming and what we're working on. But with that, I will end this. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.